Folks, we need to have a serious conversation about what is heading toward this country in August. This is Finance Economist. Hoping you're well, but honestly, I'm not sure any of us will be well once August arrives, because the amount of insanity that is converging on the United States in the next few weeks is unlike anything I've seen in my career. We're not talking about one problem. We're talking about 6 or 7 massive problems all crashing into each other at the same time, during the hottest month of the year, while Congress is on recess, while the grid is strained, while oil inventories are at what the industry calls tank bottom, while American savings have been drained to the lowest level since before the pandemic, and while the tariff price hikes that the New York Fed just warned about are scheduled to hit your grocery bill and your gas pump simultaneously. If you think things are tough right now, I need you to understand something. What you are experiencing right now is the calm before August. Let's get into it. OEL inventories are approaching empty and the industry just told the White House. Let's start with the one that affects literally every single price you pay for anything: oil. Politico and E&D News reported just weeks ago that oil industry executives are privately warning the Trump administration that petroleum inventories have been drained to what one executive described as tank bottom. That's the industry's term for when storage tanks are so low the remaining oil can't be physically pumped out. ExxonMobil's senior vice president Neil Chapman told the Bernstein Investor Conference that dated Brent crude could hit $150 or $160 per barrel soon if inventories keep declining. And a second executive told Politico that the July 4th gasoline bill was going to be higher than current prices even if the Strait of Hormuz fully reopened. Gas is sitting at $4.26 a gallon, according to AAA. But folks, that is not the ceiling. According to the industry's own projections, gas could reach $5.50 to $6 nationally if Brent hits the $150 range. And the IEA's May 2026 oil market report confirmed that approximately 10.5 million barrels per day of Gulf production is currently offline. Demand exceeds supply by 1.78 million barrels per day, and global refinery throughput is expected to plunge by 4.5 million barrels per day in the second quarter. The oil that was supposed to be flowing through the Strait of Hormuz is not flowing. The reserves that were supposed to cushion the disruption have been consumed, and the industry just walked into the White House and said we're running out. In August, during hurricane season, when Gulf Coast refinery disruptions become a seasonal risk on top of the geopolitical risk that already exists. Think about what happens if a Category 3 hurricane hits the Texas coast in August, while inventories are already at tank bottom. The answer is $7 gasoline, and I am not exaggerating. And let me explain what tank bottom actually means for you, because the phrase sounds technical and most people gloss over it. When oil industry executives use the term tank bottom, they mean that the physical storage tanks where crude oil and refined products are held before distribution have been drawn down to the point where the residual oil at the bottom cannot be extracted by standard pumping equipment. It is the absolute floor. Below that, there is nothing. And the U.S. Energy Information Administration confirmed it. Crude oil stocks held by companies fell by 8 million barrels in a single week recently, the 8th straight weekly decline. 8 consecutive weeks of inventory drops, and the government simultaneously released 8 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, bringing it near the low hit in July 2023 after the Biden-era drawdown. The SPR is being used to mask the severity of the commercial inventory decline. Without those releases, the market would already be in emergency pricing territory. And here's what most people don't understand about how oil prices cascade through the economy. Oil is not just gasoline. It is diesel that powers every truck that delivers every product to every store in America. It is jet fuel that determines airline ticket prices. It is the feedstock for fertilizer that determines the cost of every crop grown in this country. It is the raw material for plastics, pharmaceuticals, and petrochemicals that are embedded in virtually every manufactured product. When oil prices double, every price in the American economy rises with a 60 to 120-day lag. The lag from the March and April price spikes is arriving now. The lag from the June and July prices will arrive in August and September. The consumer will be hit by the current wave, and the next wave simultaneously. American savings have been drained to 2.6%, and there is nothing left to absorb the next shock. Forbes reported that the personal saving rate fell to 2.6% in April, the lowest since before the pandemic. Real disposable personal income dropped 0.5% in a single month, and yet nominal spending rose. Americans are spending more dollars to buy less stuff. Their real income is shrinking, their savings are vanishing, and the gap is being filled by credit cards, buy now, pay later plans, and 401k hardship withdrawals. Now think about what that 2.6% means in practical terms. The average American household earns approximately $80,000 after taxes. A 2.6% savings rate means they are saving roughly $170 per month. That is one car repair, one dental visit, one unexpected bill. That is the entire margin between stability and financial crisis for the average American family heading into August. And 29% of BNPL users are now financing their groceries on installment plans, according to a 2026 Lending Tree survey. That number has more than doubled in 2 years. Nearly half of all BNPL users made at least one late payment this year. More than half say they could not make ends meet without the loans. And here's the connection that most people are missing. When savings are at 2.6% and oil inventories are at tank bottom, any price spike in energy translates immediately into household crisis. Because there is no cushion, there is no buffer. The $5 gasoline that could arrive in August does not get absorbed by savings. It gets absorbed by the grocery budget, by the medication budget, by the credit card, by the BNPL plan. The consumer has nothing left, and the price spike is coming anyway. And that collision between depleted consumers and rising energy costs is the recipe for a demand collapse that could tip the economy into recession. Not in some theoretical future, in August. And let me put this another way so it really lands. McKinsey's consumer survey from Q4 2025 found that 29% of adults dipped into savings in the last quarter alone. Another 29% reduced their savings rate. 28% increased credit card usage. Credit card delinquency rates at smaller banks have hit 6.43%. Auto repossessions are at the highest level since the 2008 financial crisis. Student loan delinquencies are rising at record pace. And the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index sits at the lowest reading in the entire 75-year history of the survey, lower than during the pandemic, lower than 2008, lower than the 1970s stagflation. These are not isolated data points. They are connected. They are all measuring the same thing. The American consumer is out of money, and the American consumer is 2/3 of GDP. When 95% of Americans tell pollsters they are in an affordability crisis, as the Harris poll just confirmed, and when the savings rate confirms it, and when the delinquency data confirms it, and when the BNPL data confirms it, at what point do we stop calling it a narrative and start calling it what it is? A collapse. A slow-motion consumer collapse that is visible in every data set but invisible in the headlines because the GDP number is still positive. GDP is positive because people are borrowing to consume. Remove the borrowing and the GDP turns negative. And borrowing has limits. Credit cards have limits. BNPL plans have limits. 401k hardship withdrawals have limits. When all the limits are reached, the spending stops. And when the spending stops, so does the economy. And the limits are being reached right now, in real time, before your eyes. Heading into August, nearly half of all businesses just told the Fed they're planning more price hikes. Last week, Newsweek reported that the New York Federal Reserve published a warning that tariff-driven price increases are far from over. According to their latest business surveys, 40% of service sector firms and 70% of manufacturers are paying tariffs directly. And here's the kicker. While some have already passed costs to consumers, 47% of service firms and 44% of manufacturers told the Fed they have more tariff-related price increases planned in the next 6 months. Let me say that again. Nearly half of American businesses are planning to raise your prices further. This isn't a prediction, it's what businesses told the Federal Reserve they intend to do. The Tax Foundation already calculated that households are paying approximately $1,000 more per year from tariffs imposed since early 25. And that second wave is coming, in August, on top of the energy price increases from the Iran war disruption, on top of the embedded inflation that has already raised cumulative prices 26% since 2019. On top of the healthcare premium increases from the ACA subsidy expiration. The consumer is being hit from 4 directions simultaneously: energy, tariffs, healthcare, and embedded inflation. And there is no policy tool available that addresses all 4 at once. The Fed can raise rates to fight inflation, but that crashes the housing market and makes debt more expensive. The Fed can cut rates to support growth, but that pours gasoline on inflation that is already running above target. Congress could reduce tariffs, but the administration has signaled the opposite direction. Congress could restore healthcare subsidies, but the OBBBA specifically eliminated them. Every exit is blocked. And August is when all 4 inflationary forces converge on consumers who have a 2.6% savings rate and $170 a month of margin between stability and crisis. And let me give you a specific example of how tariff price increases hit a real household budget, because the aggregate numbers obscure the daily reality. A family of 4 spends approximately $1,050 per month on groceries at current prices. If the second wave of tariff-related price increases adds another 3 to 5% to food costs, which is consistent with the pass-through rates documented by Stanford and the Tax Foundation, that's $31 to $52 more per month on food alone. Add the gasoline increase, which at $5 per gallon versus the pre-war $2.92 adds approximately $112 per month for a single vehicle. Add the electricity increase from grid stress and war-related natural gas price escalation, which is running $40 to $60 per month above 2023 levels. Add the insurance premium increase, which for a family that lost ACA subsidies on January 1st could be $500 or more per month. The total additional monthly cost for a single American family from the converging August pressures is $683 to $724 per month. That is $8,200 to $8,700 per year, in additional costs that did not exist 18 months ago. And the median American household income has increased by approximately $2,500 over the same period. The gap between the cost increase and the income increase is $5,700 to $6,200 per year. That gap is being funded by savings depletion, credit card debt, BNPL plans, and 401k hardship withdrawals, all of which are at record or near record levels. The gap is the crisis, and the gap is widening. And it will widen further in August when the second tariff wave hits, when energy prices remain elevated, when the healthcare data arrives, and when the grid adds its own cost pressure during the hottest month of the year. The math does not work. And it doesn't matter how many times an economist says GDP is growing. GDP measures the total. The total can grow while the average American drowns, and that is exactly what is happening. The debt ceiling was raised by $5 trillion, and America is burning through it in 2 years. Now, folks, let me tell you something that almost nobody in the media is talking about. The debt ceiling was raised by $5 trillion when the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was signed in July 2025, bringing the total limit from $36.1 trillion to $41.1 trillion. And the Peter G. Peterson Foundation published an analysis that should stop every taxpayer cold. At the current pace, the United States will burn through that entire $5 trillion increase in just 2 years. 2 years. They raised the ceiling by the largest single amount in American history, and it will be exhausted by mid-2027. Do you understand what that means? It means we will be right back to another debt ceiling crisis within 24 months. Another round of extraordinary measures. Another X-date countdown. Another game of chicken between political parties using the full faith and credit of the United States as a bargaining chip. And the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget's Break Glass report warned that America is in the worst fiscal position it has ever been in, heading into a potential economic downturn. Before the Great Recession, debt was 35% of GDP. Before COVID, it was 79%. Now it's 100%. Interest payments alone exceed $1 trillion per year. That is more than the defense budget, more than Medicare. And every dollar of interest is a dollar that does not go to roads, schools, veterans, or Social Security. The government is paying more to service its past borrowing than it spends on protecting the country. And the next debt ceiling fight, which will arrive in 2027, will happen with the debt even higher, the interest even larger, and the fiscal capacity even more constrained. The $5 trillion that was supposed to give Congress breathing room is being consumed at a rate that gives them approximately 2 years before the emergency returns. That is not a solution. That is a Band-Aid on a severed artery. And here's the number that puts it in perspective. $5 trillion sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But the federal government is currently running annual deficits of approximately $2 to $2.5 trillion per year. At that burn rate, the $5 trillion increase provides approximately 2 years of borrowing authority before the next crisis hits. And the OBBBA itself added between $3 and $4.7 trillion to the debt over the next decade through its tax provisions, which means a significant portion of the very debt ceiling increase that was supposed to provide fiscal breathing room is being consumed by the deficit impact of the same law that raised the ceiling. The law created the debt that it authorized itself to borrow. Think about that for a moment. They raised the borrowing limit by $5 trillion and simultaneously passed provisions that will consume $3 to $4.7 trillion of that limit through increased deficits. The net fiscal relief is approximately $300 billion to $2 trillion, depending on which estimate you use. That is not a solution to a $36 trillion debt problem. That is a rounding error, and the interest on the debt continues to compound. At current rates, interest payments are growing by approximately $100 billion per year. By the time the next debt ceiling fight arrives in 2027, interest payments will be approaching $1.5 trillion per year. And at that point, interest will be the single largest line item in the federal budget, surpassing Social Security, surpassing defense, surpassing everything. The United States government will be spending more money paying interest to bondholders than it spends on any single program that actually serves the American people. And Congress will be back at the same table, having the same fight with even less fiscal capacity than they have now. Hurricane season peaks in August, and the grid is already under extreme stress. Here's something that keeps energy analysts up at night and that almost nobody in the general public is thinking about. August is the peak of Atlantic hurricane season. On the American electrical grid, the refining infrastructure along the Gulf Coast, and the fuel distribution network that supplies gasoline and diesel to the eastern half of the country are all operating at or near their stress limits before a single storm makes landfall. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which is the organization responsible for monitoring the grid, has been issuing warnings about summer reliability risks for 3 consecutive years. Record heat waves are pushing demand for air conditioning to levels that exceed the grid's generating capacity in multiple regions. Texas came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of total grid collapse during the February 2021 winter storm. California has implemented rolling blackouts during previous heat events, and the grid infrastructure receives a grade of C- from the American Society of Civil Engineers, with an estimated $208 billion needed to bring it to acceptable condition. Now layer the hurricane risk on top of that. The Gulf Coast refining complex, which is the largest in the world, processes the crude oil that becomes the gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and petrochemicals that the entire eastern United States depends on. When a major hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, refineries shut down preemptively. Pipeline operations are suspended, port operations are halted, and the supply of refined products to the rest of the country is disrupted for days or weeks. In a normal year with healthy inventories, the system can absorb a Gulf Coast disruption for a few weeks without catastrophic consequences. But this is not a normal year. Inventories are at tank bottom. The SPR is at its lowest level since the 1980s, and global oil supply is already short by 1.78 million barrels per day because of the Strait of Hormuz closure. A major hurricane in August 2026 would not be a disruption. It would be a compounding event on top of multiple existing disruptions. And the price consequences would be immediate, severe, and potentially lasting. And I want to walk you through exactly what happened the last time a major hurricane hit the Gulf Coast during a period of elevated oil prices, because history is the best predictor we have. In September 2005, Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast. Gasoline prices spiked from $2.50 to over $3 nationally within days. In some markets, prices exceeded $4. But it wasn't just gas prices. Katrina shut down approximately 95% of Gulf of Mexico oil production and 88% of natural gas production. Refineries along the Louisiana and Mississippi coast were offline for weeks, and the Colonial Pipeline, which carries 2.5 million barrels per day of refined products from the Gulf to the East Coast, was disrupted. Gas stations from Virginia to Florida ran dry. In 2021, during Winter Storm Uri, Texas experienced a power failure that killed at least 246 people and caused over $195 billion in economic damage. The grid came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of a total collapse that engineers said would have taken months to restore. In May 2021, a ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline shut it down for 6 days. Gas stations across the Southeast ran dry within 48 hours. Panic buying stripped every station bare. 6 days. That's how fragile the system is under normal conditions. Under the conditions heading into August 2026, with inventories at tank bottom, the SPR at multi-decade lows, global supply short by 1.78 million barrels per day, and the grid already under heat stress, a major hurricane would not produce a temporary disruption. It would produce a compounding catastrophe, because there are no reserves to draw on, there is no spare capacity to activate, there is no strategic buffer to release. Everything that was supposed to protect against exactly this scenario has already been consumed by the previous emergencies that nobody cleaned up after. The first official data on healthcare and food assistance losses arrives this summer. Brookings documented something that most Americans have no idea is about to happen. The Congressional Budget Office projects that approximately 5 million Americans will lose health insurance as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. An additional 2 million will lose access to SNAP food assistance in a typical month due to expanded work requirements. And the first official data measuring these losses is expected to arrive this summer. The National Health Interview Survey data that would reflect the January 1st ACA subsidy expiration would typically come out in the summer months. The first SNAP enrollment data reflecting the expanded work requirements should also be published this year. What this means is that sometime in August or September, the country is going to see the first hard numbers on how many Americans actually lost coverage in food assistance since the law took effect. And those numbers are going to be devastating, because the cuts were implemented during a period of rising prices, falling savings, stagnant real wages, and consumer exhaustion that is visible in every dataset published in 2026. The CBO projection of 5 million losing coverage was based on their modeling assumptions. The actual number could be higher because the modeling did not account for the Iran war's inflationary impact, the tariff price hikes, the savings rate collapse, or the consumer sentiment decline to record lows. Every one of those factors makes it harder for people to afford the unsubsidized premiums and makes it more likely that they drop coverage entirely. And when the data arrives, it's going to land in the middle of an August where gas prices are elevated, food prices are climbing from the tariff second wave, the grid is stressed by heat, and hurricane season is peaking. The timing could not be worse. And the data will confirm what 95% of Americans already told the Harris poll they believe: the country is in an affordability crisis. Except now it won't be a poll, it will be a body count. A count of the Americans who lost their health care and their food assistance in the richest country in the history of the world, because Congress decided that $3.9 trillion in tax cut extensions was more important than $250 billion in health care subsidies. And folks, I want you to understand the cruel mathematics of that decision because it reveals everything you need to know about who the economy is designed to serve. The OBBBA continued $3.9 trillion in expiring tax cuts that primarily benefit upper-income households and corporations. And at the same time, it let the enhanced ACA premium subsidies expire, which cost approximately $250 billion over 10 years and protected 20 million middle-class and low-income Americans from healthcare premium shock. The cost of maintaining those subsidies was approximately 6.4% of the cost of continuing the tax cuts. The government chose to spend $3.9 trillion on tax extensions and refused to spend $250 billion, which is the financial equivalent of spending $390 on dinner for yourself and refusing to spend $25 on food for your children. That is the priority structure of the federal government in 2026. And the consequences of that priority structure will be measured in August when the first hard data on coverage losses arrives and confirms that millions of Americans are now uninsured. Not because they don't want insurance, not because they are irresponsible, but because the government that collects their taxes decided their health care was worth 6.4% of the value it placed on continuing tax cuts for people who didn't need them. Congress is on recess in August, and nobody will be in Washington to manage any of this. And here is the final piece that ties everything together and makes August uniquely dangerous. Congress goes on recess. The legislative body that is supposed to respond to economic emergencies, that is supposed to manage fiscal crises, that is supposed to authorize emergency measures, that is supposed to represent the interests of 330 million Americans, will not be in session during the month when every pressure I just described converges. They will be in their districts. They will be campaigning for the November midterms. They will be attending town halls and fundraisers and ribbon cuttings while the price of gasoline climbs, while the grid strains under record heat, while the first healthcare loss data arrives, while businesses implement the next round of tariff-driven price increases, and while American households with $170 a month in savings try to figure out how to make it to September. And if something goes wrong, if a hurricane hits the Gulf Coast, if the Iran war reignites, if a major bank reports unexpected losses from its commercial real estate portfolio, if the consumer spending data shows the demand collapse that the savings rate is already signaling, Congress will not be in session to respond. They will have to be called back from recess for an emergency session, which takes time during which markets can panic, prices can spike, and the damage can compound. The last time a major economic event happened while Congress was on recess was August 2011, when the S&P downgrade hit and the stock market lost $2.4 trillion in household wealth in a single week. Congress was not in session to respond. The damage was done before they returned. On August 2026 has more converging pressures than August 2011 by an order of magnitude. And here's the irony that should make every American angry. The members of Congress who will be on recess in August are the same people who voted for the legislation that eliminated the ACA subsidies, that expanded the SNAP work requirements, that added $3 to $4.7 trillion to the debt, and that failed to address the oil reserve depletion. They created the conditions that are converging in August, and they will not be in Washington when those conditions produce consequences for the 330 million people who live inside the economy they built. They will be at campaign events, raising money, shaking hands, promising that the economy is strong and that their policies are working, and the gasoline will be $5, and the grocery bill will be $1,200 a month for a family of 4. And the first data on healthcare coverage losses will be published, and the grid will be straining under record heat, and the consumer will be spending their last $170 of monthly savings while financing the rest on installment plans for food they need to survive. That is August 2026. That is what is coming. And the people who are supposed to manage it will be on vacation. So folks, I'm going to level with you. I've been covering economic trends for a long time, and I don't remember a month that had this many simultaneous risk factors converging on the American economy at once. Oil inventories at tank bottom, consumer savings at the lowest level since before COVID, nearly half of all businesses planning more price increases, a $5 trillion debt ceiling raise being burned through in 2 years, hurricane season peaking while the grid is already strained, the first official data on healthcare and food assistance losses arriving, and Congress on recess with nobody in Washington to manage any of it. Each one of these by itself would be concerning. Together they create a risk environment that is genuinely alarming, and the American consumer, the person whose spending accounts for 2/3 of GDP, is entering this month with a 2.6% savings rate, maxed out credit cards, BNPL balances on their groceries, and real disposable income that is falling. That is not a consumer who can absorb shocks. That is a consumer who is one shock away from pulling back on spending entirely. And if the consumer pulls back, GDP contracts. And if GDP contracts during a month when every other pressure is already elevated, the recession that every economist has been debating for 2 years stops being a debate and starts being a data point. What can you do? Reduce your discretionary spending now before August forces you to contracts. Fill your gas tank before the prices climb higher. Stock shelf-stable food at current prices. Review your insurance coverage. Check your emergency fund. If it's at $170 a month in savings, start building it immediately. Even $50 a week matters. And pay attention, because August is coming, and it is bringing everything with it. Oil at tank bottom. Savings at 2.6%. Tariff price hikes hitting. Healthcare data arriving. Hurricane season peaking. Grid straining. And Congress on vacation. 7 converging pressures in 1 month on a consumer who has nothing left. I have been doing this long enough to know that the difference between the people who weather these storms and the people who are devastated by them is almost always the same thing. Preparation. Not luck, not income, not politics. Preparation. The families who filled their tanks before the spike, who stocked their pantries before the tariff wave, who paid down their variable rate debt before the rates climbed, who knew their insurance options before the enrollment deadline passed, those families get through. And the families who waited, who assumed someone else was handling it, who trusted the headlines over their own instincts, those families discover the cost of waiting when the bill arrives and the buffer is already gone. Don't be the second family, be the first one. Start today, because August does not negotiate, and it does not wait.